without it. The river has been a super highway for an unknown amount of people and goods. It has served as the border between two empires. It's been the line between freedom and enslavement, and a natural force that we have tried to reckon with forever, always will, and will always fail. At 2,400 miles, it is the longest river on the continent, and just north of St. Louis, it combines forces with the Missouri River in a place known as the Confluence. The meeting of the two great rivers is represented on the St. Louis City flag, which flies on the top deck of the boat, and it also flies in front of the arch. You may see it there. And the flag features two rivers that come together. And where they come together, there's a yellow circle with a fleur-de-lis in the center, and that's a reference to the French influence on the city's founding. French fur trading post of St. Louis was founded in 1764 in the exact spot now occupied by the arch. Of course, people have been living in this area for thousands of years, and not just living. We had a metropolis on the Illinois side of the river at one time. In 1100 AD, the Mississippian indigenous culture had a city that's just a few miles from here that had more people than London did at the time.
Wow.
Of course, that civilization had left that location by the time that the Europeans arrived several hundred years later, leaving behind large earthen mound structures. And you can visit those if you go to the Cahokia Mounds Historic Site. But those earthen mounds and earthworks were on the Missouri side as well, and they were all throughout what is now the St. Louis area. And several of them were big enough to be landmarks on the side of the river for people traveling north and south. So the French Creole village would be under Spanish colonial rule for the first 30 years until the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. St. Louis held a really unique position. It was a border city between two countries. And when Lewis and Clark came here in 1804 to prepare for their big expedition, they had to have French translators with them to speak to the city leaders. When the purchase was finalized in 1804, there was a ceremony held in St. Louis called Three Flags Day, which was supposed to include, just a couple hours of the Spanish flag going up, and then the French, and then the American. Spanish flag went up, came down a few hours later, and then the French flag went up. But it was supposed to come down not too long after that, except the village started to reminisce and started to kind of party and started to think about their French heritage in the past, and started singing songs, and started drinking, and the party was all into the night. And so the American flag was not raised until the next day. The first steamboat arrived in St. Louis in 1817, and by the middle of the 19th century, dozens of them a day would be making their way to and from St. Louis, and there would be hundreds a day up and down the Mississippi River. All of that commerce, grew, the city grew so rapidly that by 1900, we were the fifth largest city in the United States. Throughout the 19th century, the riverfront welcomed tens of thousands of immigrants from around the world and from other parts of the country, either to make their home here or to prepare for their journey westward. And the ride today is going to talk a lot about the North Riverfront, the South Riverfront, as well as some on the Illinois side as well. And during those eras, the riverfront would have been, just a crush of warehouses and factories and people and rail yards and stockyards. So much life happening right up against the river. There would have been people living close to the river, and that's still the case. As we're on the ride today, you may see people that have made, encampments alongside the river. That's something that people have done for hundreds of years. During the Great Depression, there was a large shanty town in this general area. It had thousands of people living in it up close to the river. In my job, where I talk St. Louis history all the time, and I can never tire of doing it, I am asked constantly, well, what's your favorite thing? You gotta have a favorite thing. And it's this bridge. It is this thing that we are sliding under right now. This is the Eads Bridge. It's named after James Buchanan Eads, and that was the chief engineer on the project. It was built in the 1860s.
Wow.
It's a really big deal on so many levels. One, it was a chance finally for rail traffic to cross the Mississippi River at St. Louis, so that really helps commerce after the Civil War. It's also engineering-wise a huge deal. Those steel spans, those are 500 feet wide. Those are 200 feet wide, wider than any steel span that had been suggested at the time.
Wow.
Everybody thought he was crazy that Eads, when he designed this, but he was correct. It was a that lower deck, that's part of the original design of the bridge. That train's going to disappear into a tunnel underneath the city of St. Louis, come out near Busch Stadium. That's all part of the original Eames Bridge design. When we're coming back down the river, I'll talk more about the bridge. On the Missouri side, we're passing by the Cleves Landing. If you were here in the 1980s, 1990s, that might have been, you might have some good stories to tell about some nights out on the Cleves Landing. It's a lot quieter these days, but there are lots of good initiatives at new parks and some buildings and new things to bring development to that area. As historians and architectural historians, one of our last pieces of the original, the late 19th century riverfront with those big warehouses, factories, and buildings that looked like all of that architecture was removed in the 1930s to make way for the Gateway Arch. On the Illinois side of the river, looks like a pretty nondescript shoreline over there. Got some sand, got some rocks, flood wall of some kind, and levee. But if we were coming by this in the 19th century, we would be passing by an island. And that island, we actually would have already passed a couple of islands already. There was one called Duncan Island that people actually lived on. Further south down the river, there was an island known as Arsenal Island, which was at the foot of Arsenal Street next to the Federal Arsenal. One time it was a cemetery. There's more to that story. And then there's Quarantine Island, a place for boats to stop if there was some kind of suspicion of smallpox or typhoid or cholera. But this particular island was Bloody Island, and it's still the name of that little piece of land. If you look on your phone, it'll say you're right next to Bloody Island. And it has that name because that island was the official place for people to fight duels in the late 18th century, early 19th century.
Wow.
And people would watch the two men. If a duel would happen, I think a lot of us now, thanks to Hamilton, we're all I'm pretty sure how duels were. But someone's honor was if they were offended, they would call for a duel. Two men take two different boats out to the island. They would disappear into the woods. There would be people watching at the shoreline, and they would wait for the crack of gunfire, and then hold a rest to see what happened. And there are several really large profile or high profile duels that happened there. The last duel, they were pretty much done doing that by the 1850s. By then it was pretty common. It was much more accepted to argue in public, not have to have a duel. But the last duel that was held there was by two men. The duel was over the issue of enslavement. And we, as historians, would call it the duel of the governors. Because both men later were governor of Missouri.
Wow. I thought in a duel somebody died. I thought they both lived to be governor. I'm going to video while we go down. When we come back, I'm just going to sit and enjoy.
On the Missouri side, we're now coming into an area that we call the Near North Riverfront. And this would have been, again, a packed industrial area with its own wharf, dozens of steamboats docked alongside it. The big building that dominates the riverfront there is the Ashley Street Powerhouse. It was built in 1902 and it's still in use today. It's not an abandoned building, but on the inside it's very modern. It does not match its historic exterior. The Powerhouse is a great example of Beaux-Arts industrial architecture, and its dirty appearance can be attributed to many years of coal smoke coming out of that thing, and that coal smoke was absorbed into the building. Gives it that nice patina. All of St. Louis would have had that patina, but it's one that still has it. The Powerhouse provided electricity for St. Louis's 1904 World's Fair, which was held 8 miles away in Forest Park. Hopefully those of you that are visiting us from out of town are going to make some time for Forest Park. The building now provides steam power for downtown St. Louis. We were on this boat in the late 19th century. We would now be looking on the Missouri side at a massive complex called the Belcher Sugar Refinery. Belcher Sugar Refinery covered several blocks. They employed 600 people. It was one of the largest sugar refineries in the world.
Wow. Wow.
So the wharf and the dock, right? And this would have been a riverfront, more like what's in front of the arch and not a flood wall. The dock would have been covered in boats that were bringing raw sugar, taking away refined sugar, and they kind of dominated the use of that wharf. The Belcher Sugar Refinery, after a couple of years, they decided that maybe Mississippi River water wasn't the best water for refining sugar, and so they decided to dig a well on the side of their factory. That well ended up being several thousand feet deep.
Wow.
They did find water, but not necessarily better water. They found highly sulfuric water.
Wow.
But at the time, people thought that was artisanal water. That was water that had health benefits. And so the Belcher company started packaging that water. They started sending it to hotels and restaurants in downtown St. Louis, and people would buy it and drink this sulfuric water. Eventually, the demand was big enough that Belcher created a pipeline that took the water from their factory in the near North Riverfront into downtown, directly to the Belcher Health Spa. And the Health Spa, which was kind of where the Hampton is downtown, Hampton Inn is downtown, featured all kinds of places for aerobics and whatever people did at health spas in the early 20th century. But they also featured this water that was piped through there. From the Missouri side, our next building we're going to talk about is this long building. You see a mural on the side of it, bright colors, and birds flying through the air. That is the Cotton Belt building. It was originally home to the Cotton Belt Freight Depot. It was built in 1913, 730 feet long. You can't tell from this angle, but it's a really beautiful, slender building. It still has some nice detailing on it. And that would have been a freight depot, so trains coming and going, carrying cotton from Texas, Arkansas, and Missouri. You can notice it's currently open to the elements. There are no windows, you're looking straight through, but there are several people that live there, and they've created small urban farms, little animals there and vegetables, and they're self-sustaining little settlements on that land. The flood wall that sits in front of it, the flood wall was built in 1959. There had been a catastrophic flood in about 10 to 12 years earlier in 1947 that was significantly higher than the 1993 flood that more modern history. But so the flood wall was built in 1959. At its height, it is 52 feet tall. It's 11 miles long, and it cost over $130 million to build.
Gracious.
And it is what saves our city whenever there's catastrophic flooding. In 1993, the water crested just 2 feet below the top of that wall. In 2019, it was just a foot or so below that.
Goodness.
Featured in St. Louis over 40 years. Broke back in 2014 at the cost of about $665 million.
Wow.
It is a 2,800-foot long cable stay bridge with towers that stand about 400 feet above the water line. That's almost 2/3 height of Gateway Arch. There's a lot of structural steel inside the bridge, about 50 million pounds worth, 132 miles of cable, and 1.4 million pounds of rebar. It's designed to last about 100 years. Now these towers are about 1,500 feet apart, which makes it the third longest cable stay bridge in the United States. It does carry Interstate 7. And one thing you may have noticed, the bridge does not have bridge piers in the middle of the spans here. That's for safety reasons, so the boats don't come down and hit them. But that's not always true. Look over to your left right now, there's one bridge pier. You can see right here, there's a little chunk of concrete that's been knocked out of it. That came from boat kind of backing off this dock in front of us. And the barge struck that bridge pier, knocked off a little chunk there by that 55 mark.
Oh, wow.
And those numbers you're looking at back on that bridge pier, these are sort of gauges for high water. Now let's say, for instance, you're coming down the river, you look at this gauge, you see the water's at that 55 mark, and you have a 60-foot boat. There's a good chance you're going to knock about 5 feet of your boat off when you pass into this bridge.
Wow.
And here to our left again, we have another grain floating elevator known as Tyler Street. Way over to your right against the bank there, you can see there's a boat sort of pushing to the bank. It's a little fishing boat. Now, believe it or not, we do have fish in the river. The most common type of fish you catch out would be catfish, gar, and carp.
History on the Mississippi. She was on a riverboat. She was on a barge, actually.
Sand and sediment along the way, and those things are suspended in the water, and that's what gives it that color. If you were a tourist to St. Louis in the mid-19th century, you would have been quite surprised when you asked for your first glass of water and you were handed a chocolate-covered glass of water to drink. And the person handing it to you would have thought there was no problem whatsoever with that water. In fact, the people in St. Louis thought that by drinking the Mississippi River water that was brown with all this mud and stuff in it, that was a health thing. That actually made them healthier. There was benefits to that mud. So once you learned how to drink that muddy water, you would know that before you finished your glass, you would stir it. You didn't want them to lose any of those nutrients. So if it had settled to the bottom of your glass, you would stir it before drinking it. It wasn't until 1904 that St. Louisans got their first glass of clear water. And that's because the world was invited to St. Louis. They were supposed to come here for the World's Fair. It's a big deal. And they were going to just be, this beautiful fair was being designed with all these lakes and waterfalls and fountains and things that would not have really been pulled off the same if they were full of muddy water. So the city leaders and the park planners brought a man in who had a scientific process that he could clear, he could get the clear water flowing. So that's when that first came through. It wouldn't be though until 1911 or 1912 that St. Louis had its first official water treatment plan to clean the water. And how that water is treated and cleaned north of where we are right now before it passes through an industrial area. All right, so I'm going to